Good afternoon, everyone. It's great to be here again for our second in our Canadian Nonprofits Government Fundraising 101 series. And I'm really thrilled to be joined by a guest today as well. I'm just going to give you just a bit of background on the series and our work, and then I will introduce Micah, who has very kindly joined us today. So my name is Jessie Clark, and I founded my firm, Jan Clark Consulting, in February 2021, right in the middle of the pandemic. We are a progressive feminist government relations firm, and our main mission is helping empower nonprofits to achieve their goals with government. So I founded this firm because I've seen many organizations face unnecessary hurdles and challenges in building a strong relationship with government over the years. And I really believe that advocacy, engagement, and seeking government funding are everyone's business, and that nonprofits not only deserve a seat at the table, but frankly, it's very important to have their voices. Why do I believe this? After spending 9 years in the federal civil service and non-governmental organizations, I can see the potential, and I've been on the front line of these relationships, and I've seen when they work well and sometimes when they don't work as well, and what the impact can be both on government and the organizations. I'm very excited to be here for part 2 of this LinkedIn Live series. In this series, I'm sharing a number of top tips on government funding for your Canadian nonprofit organization. During LinkedIn Live last Monday, we talked about where to look for funding and how to determine if you're eligible. And over the next few weeks, we're going to be covering a number of other topics, including how to position your organization for a strong government relationship. And once you've started to receive funding, how to ensure you keep getting funding over the long run, because it's one thing to get it, and it's another thing to have it renewed frequently. But for today, we're joined by a special guest and a former colleague of mine, Micah Anshin. Micah and I met at Right to Play when I was Director of Program Partnerships for International Programs, and Micah was the Partnerships Manager for Canadian Programs. And we had the pleasure of working together on a number of Canadian government files. And Micah is now Director of Government Relations at Futurepreneur Canada, which is a national nonprofit dedicated to supporting young entrepreneurs. And he can tell us a bit more about that work and that role as well. And he's also a member of the board for the Ontario chapter of the Public Affairs Association of Canada, which is a leading professional association for government relations folks like us. Micah, during his career, has navigated a number of complex challenges in his work and has great insights to share. And so pleased that you can be with us today, Micah. Thank you so much. So maybe you could start by just telling us a little bit about your current role at Futurepreneur, and just a little bit about what your organization does right now.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for having me here today, Jessie, and great to see everybody on the call. So as Jessie mentioned, my name is Mike Anshin. I'm the Director of Government Relations for Futurepreneur. And the work that we do is we're a national nonprofit dedicated to supporting diverse, aspiring young entrepreneurs to launch their business. So we actually have a program that supports them right from business planning stage, so coaching on that, on their cash flow, right through to a $60,000 collateral-free loan for any young entrepreneur age 18 to 39 who's looking to launch their business in the next 12 months or who have launched their business in the previous 12 months. We have a very strong partnership with the Government of Canada through ISED, so Industry, Science and Economic Development, where we have currently a 5-year partnership, but we've been partnered with various federal governments since 2003, so very much a long-term partnership there. And in my role, it's to manage and steward that relationship, and obviously always with the eye to renewal in the future, and as well to sort of match that funding with provincial partnerships across the country. So right now we do have provincial partnerships with Alberta, Manitoba, Ontario, New Brunswick, and Nova Scotia as well as a sponsorship in Saskatchewan. So yeah, happy to be here, lots to discuss. And if anyone is ever interested in following up or learning more, you can find me on LinkedIn or on Twitter at Micah Anshin.
Great. Thanks so much, Micah, and great to hear just a little bit about your work at Futurepreneur. I think that it's always a fun experience when you get to manage both federal and several different provincial relationships, because that can be, each province in Canada has a unique political culture as well. And before I go further and dig into that, I just wanted to mention that our comments, our chat on LinkedIn is being moderated by my colleague Rachel Faith, who can answer any questions you might have or direct you to any information you might need. But yeah, I mean, so you've had experience, working federally, working for different provinces, and working on different issues as well over the years. But I think within all of that, there's probably some common experiences, working on government relations for nonprofits. And so I think my first question for you would be, from your own experience, what has been the most challenging part of government relations work within nonprofits?
For sure. And I think that's a great place to start, because one thing that I think affects all aspects of nonprofits and the charitable sector is just time and resources, right? I mean, we're working with very limited resources. Every dollar is so important and so difficult to fundraise and needs to be allocated properly to make sure you're getting the maximum return on that. And then on top of that, there are so many different priorities for the leadership, for the fundraisers, for us as sort of government relations professionals, that just sort of ensuring that we're stewarding that properly and strategizing properly, that I find to sort of be the most difficult thing. There's a lot of different activities and priorities that can be focused on when it comes to government relations. And it's really about sort of drilling down and finding the ones that are going to make the most sense for your organization. And I'll probably come back to it a few times, but I talk about ROI and return on investment a lot. And that's not only when you're going to government to say, well, this investment that you can make is going to have this, return, whether that's a financial return on investment or a social return on investment. And there's lots of great work on SROI as well, but also thinking about it for your own time and resources and your own staff's time as well. So, you don't need to apply to every single, proposal or funding opportunity that's out there. But at the same time, we all have budgets that we need to make and fundraising targets that we need to achieve. So just how are you navigating that, and basically how are you managing your time? I always find that to be the most difficult challenge.
Oh, yeah, and I can definitely relate to that from my own experience. I think it's very interesting, because I think that there's certainly a strong sense within many nonprofits that government fundraising is important. That there's in some nonprofits there's even a heavy reliance on government fundraising, and you can argue about whether that's I think that can be great, and it can be somewhat risky as well, obviously. But I think it's also hard sometimes to make people understand within nonprofits that it does sometimes cost some money to raise that money. It's not always a given. And at the same token, I think nonprofits are a great testament to how much you can do with very little, and how effective you can be. And so maybe then just to go on to another question for you related to that, which is, if your organization, say you're working for an organization that's brand new to the world of government funding, and you've never received funding from the government, where do you think that you should start as an organization?
Yeah, and that's a great question. And the other thing I wanted to note is just the government has so many priorities as well. And when sometimes we can sort of get a little bit of tunnel vision or forget that we're not the only priority, that your organization is not the only priority for the department that you might want to work with. So really thinking about how you can sort of cut through the noise with your messaging, and again, sort of make that outreach as efficient as possible is something that I spend a lot of time thinking about and talking to my colleagues about. For those that have sort of are maybe just dipping their toe into this water and kind of just starting on the government relations track, the thing that I sort of typically advise to start out with is a bit of a mapping project. So understanding what are the relevant departments that you're going to want to work with. I mean, obviously the Prime Minister's office, finance, these are key central areas that you're going to want to connect with pretty much regardless of the work that you're doing. But then from there, sort of understanding what are the right ministries, what are the right departments to actually target with your outreach, because some of them are not going to be relevant. And the other thing is to also look at what issue area you're focused on and understanding what the jurisdictional boundaries of that are. So, you don't want to necessarily go to the federal government with something that is much more relevant for the provincial government, because you don't want them to say, well, we love what you're doing, but this is actually, outside of the scope of our mandate and the work that we do. So I would typically start with that sort of mapping project. What are the right departments, and then who's the right minister for that department? Who's the parliamentary secretary? for that minister, who are the right civil servants, the right officials in that department at all different levels. So going from the deputy minister right down to a junior policy advisor, because you might be able to get more time with that policy advisor than a deputy minister, and then really having a document where you're kind of laying that all out with their contact information. If for the ministers, what do their mandate letters say? How can you maybe refer back to that in any outreach that you're doing to really sort of cut through that noise as well? And then on top of that, looking at what we might refer to as backbenchers or MPs that don't have a parliamentary secretary role or don't have a ministerial role, but maybe you're doing a lot of work in their riding. And so maybe it's very relevant to that individual, the work that you're doing and the ask that you're going to make. And so, make sure that they're on the list as well. And then finally, the opposition. I don't think we talk, enough about opposition outreach, but it is an important part of government relations. And so understanding who the shadow cabinet is and what the relevant shadow cabinet minister is for your work. They should also definitely be on that list. And then again, when you're looking at that riding by riding breakdown of where you do work, who are the right MPs to reach out to. Once that's complete, I would typically go to my leadership and also the board of directors, who, in some cases can be very well connected, and have an understanding from them, like, do they know or have relationships with anybody, on your list? Do they live in the riding, for example, of a relevant cabinet minister, and might be able to get a meeting with them sort of in their MP role, but then you can obviously speak to the work that your organization does, and then kind of melding those two together, prioritizing again finance, the PMO, and your relevant ministers and parliamentary secretaries, and kind of going at it in that order, but then really having a good scope of, these are the priorities that we have and sort of the strategic approach to outreach. And these are the connections that we might have from our own internal stakeholders that might be able to get us a warm introduction, and then starting there.
Yeah, that's excellent advice. I think that it's important to do your homework a little bit so that you're going in, feeling confident that you're talking to the right people, and that a little bit about what their priorities and their issues are, and how your own priorities and issues might align with what they're working on as well. So I think that's great advice. I mean, one thing that comes to mind is, as you're describing that, I think, is that some people are intimidated to approach politicians, right, or even to approach civil servants. And it's one thing to sort of, look online and find out who your MP is. In your experience, how receptive have people been when you've been asking for meetings on behalf of organizations, and what's worked for you in getting meetings?
Yeah, that's a really great point, because one thing I do find, and I've done both corporate fundraising and sort of government relations, and I work very closely, with our corporate fundraising team. And sometimes there is a bit of these people are elected officials and there's almost an aura around them. But, at the end of the day, people are people, and they're very actually approachable. And, everyone who got into politics or the civil service, they really did get into it because they want to make a positive difference in the world. And that very much aligns with the nonprofit and charitable sector as well. So I actually find, they're very receptive to having an informational meeting or a conversation. They, really appreciate the opportunity to give advice and try to make things better for their constituents, for their people in their riding, but also, to fulfill their mandate or kind of do the work that government is really set out to do. So I think, it is something that people kind of overthink a little bit in terms of like, how are we going to approach this? Are we going to say the right things? And I think once you're in the meeting and you've, exchanged some pleasantries and had a laugh or two, you kind of realize like they're here for the same reasons that you are. And that's to make, this country and this world a better place. So I do find that they're quite open to the conversations. Another piece of advice I might just share about sort of first-time applicants is there's always a question around sort of operational funding, or are you looking for project-based funding? And I will say that if you haven't received government funding before, an approach I might suggest is to look for project-based funding, so a little bit more a bit smaller, but a bit more discrete in terms of what the project actually would be, because you can use that as a proof case for demonstrating that return on investment or that success to the department, and then going forward from there with a much more, a larger or an operational ask.
Starting small, yeah, it's a great point. And starting with something very concrete, I think, is a great a great way to start. And I think that the point about, I think it's you can't emphasize enough for people, I think, that the idea that these are just people as well who are trying to do their jobs, right? And so for what you want is to help them feel like they can do their jobs well, and help them feel like they're being effective at doing their jobs, and help them feel good about the meetings they're having. That sounds very simplistic, but it's really that simple in some cases, that, as long as you can get alignment around those things with what you're looking for and their interests, there's a real sweet spot there that, can make for some great successes for your organization.
100%, and that's why even in an email, if it's pertinent, I'll refer back to the mandate letter of a minister, because it's basically trying to hint that, like, these are sort of your marching orders from the PMO, and we can actually help you fulfill that mandate. We can help you do your job, more effectively or more efficiently, and with greater impact. And here's how.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And it's great now that that's become much more of a common thing to publish mandate letters and have them be publicly available, because they're a great source of information. So if you say you're looking at a federal department and you see that, you've found some funding opportunities that are coming up, that you think your organization is eligible for, you've seen maybe 2 or 3 that are coming from this department. How would you suggest you prepare as an organization and prioritize as well?
For sure. So I always suggest to really dive into those the eligibility documents, and kind of typically now there's like an application guide, quite detailed application guide that will go along with that, and kind of categorizing it on that basis. So understanding, like, what is the best opportunity, both in terms of the impact it's going to have on your organization, but also the likelihood that you're actually going to be successful with the ask. It isn't, a typical case necessarily that a single funding body or department is going to actually approve like 2 or 3 or 4 grants or funding agreements to the same organization at the same time. So that doesn't mean you shouldn't be applying for all of them, even if you might not get all of them. Like, I think it is good to cast a wide net, and to try to put as many opportunities out there as possible, but then just really prioritizing the ones that are the most strategic for you. So going back to the last question, if you're a first-time applicant and there's one much larger multi-year sort of operational opportunity versus more of a project-based one, you might want to steer more towards that project-based one, because it'll demonstrate your capacity to actually manage the public funds, deliver on that, and then kind of grow from there. And then at the end of the day, again, I go back to sort of that internal ROI question. What's going to be the greatest return for the organization in terms of funding, but also the level of effort that would actually be required for doing that? So is this, something that's going to require you to drift your mission a little bit, or stand up an entirely new program, or is the funding adequate to actually do that? Versus, it's much more of an operational, maybe it's a scaling grant and you have a proven project and it's something that you had in your strategic plan that you wanted to grow anyway, and this perfectly aligns with that. Then kind of go full force, I'd say, into that direction. Oftentimes I've seen it where there's multiple proposals due around the same time, and it can be a lot of stress on your staff to try to get all of those in, when you might know that the likelihood of getting all of them is actually quite low. And so then I would have that discussion with your team and kind of prioritize the ones that really make the most sense for you. Because I'd say, rather than putting in 3 or 4 only okay proposals, way better to put in 1 or 2 of the strongest proposal that you have, the best foot forward, all of the data, all the budgeting is there and ready to go. So I think those are kind of the suggestions I would give. And then if you do have a relationship with someone at the department, I think having a quick phone call to sort of say, this is what we're thinking around these opportunities. What kind of makes the most sense for you? Does this align with what you're thinking? Like, yes, we see what's online, but can I just sort of, gut check this with you for a minute? They should be able to hopefully give you a little bit of guidance. And if you don't have a relationship, this could actually be an opportunity to build one. So you could even say, like, I know, we haven't spoken before, but I'm, new to this work or new to this department, and I'd love to learn more about what your priorities are, and how we might be able to work together. And then again, strategize from there.
Yeah, thanks for that, Mike. I see that we have a question as well, so we'll get to that one. I think it's a great question in just a minute. I wanted to just 2 things I want to pick up on from what you said as well. I think that when you're looking at when you're a brand new organization, or you're new to government funding and you've never received government funding before, it's definitely important, as you mentioned, Mike, to kind of have the government's perspective in mind, which is that this is a risky investment for them potentially, right? they have to, they need to feel confident that when they're recommending your work up to the chain, within their internal hierarchy, that you're going to yield results for them. And I think one of the ways that I've advised people to kind of get around that a little bit is also to partner with other organizations. And sometimes that's a great way of getting your foot in the door and establishing credibility. You can go in with someone who has already had that experience, has passed those evaluations for risk, et cetera, and then build up your own reputation the same way. So that's just one thought that came to mind. And then you were also just mentioning, in terms of how to decide around how to use limited internal resources, right? And I think that's such an important point for nonprofits to really consider carefully. You don't have unlimited resources to write proposals, unlimited staff time, and so be thoughtful about which opportunities you're going to go for. And so I just want to, while I have a minute here, I'm just going to pick up on there's two questions that have come up so far in the chat that are excellent questions. The first one is to suggest the best ways to find out about funding opportunities. So the first thing I'm going to say about that is that actually the first session that I gave back a couple of weeks back is actually entirely focused on that. So we're hoping to get it up on YouTube if it's not there already. We're working on. We're all GR people in my firm, and none of us are tech people, so you have to bear with us a little bit. But that being said, I think when you look at there are some some great places and some good information. I would say federally and particularly online about current programs and opportunities. And almost every department federally has a section on grants and contributions where you can look at potential funding opportunities. So that's certainly one way. But I think what I talked about last week was really kind of doing your homework a lot more in depth as well, and looking at what are the kinds of programs that they've been announcing and who's getting that funding, and then trying to dig a bit deeper, because sometimes there are questions that sometimes there's funding available that's announced publicly, and sometimes there's funding that's not announced publicly, that's only issued by invitation, or even that's kind of created by virtue of the relationship you have. So I would say it's great to find out about available funding opportunities and apply for those. And I certainly, whenever I see ones that I think would be of interest, I share them on my LinkedIn or my Twitter. And I know others do as well. But I think it's also good to try and create those opportunities. So I don't know, Micah, if you want to add to that, and then I'm actually going to go to the next question, which I think would be a good one for you as well to think about in terms of someone's mentioning, the idea of making a pre-budget submission. And this kind of goes to, we were going to talk about this a little bit about policy engagement and the importance of engaging, broadly as an organization in discussions and in other forums as well, and consultations, and not just only focusing your relationship on asking for funding. And so this question is basically saying, are you have recommendations on, key points to hit on a pre-budget submission if you're making one? And those can be made federally or provincially, just for information as well.
For sure. So, I mean, I think the way you answered the first question about sort of where to find funding opportunities is pretty much exactly how I would have answered it. I mean, each website does typically list anything that's sort of publicly available. And then at the same time, just sort of understanding that there are always those opportunities to kind of create your own funding bucket or create your own opportunities through some of those key policy windows. So obviously, the annual budget provincially and federally is the main one. There is also the fall economic statement, and occasionally there will be opportunities, there to add something to the budget sort of mid-year. It's definitely a bit more difficult and requires a bit more nuance, but it isn't something that you necessarily want to give up on. And even if you don't get it, it sort of gives you a foot in the door for that budget conversation, which is starting right around this time of year already, right? So I think for sure, just sort of keeping your eye on those announcements. One thing I've kind of found recently that I will just sort of like point out for folks to be aware of is that just because sort of a funding bucket has been announced, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's actually the call is open yet. So also paying attention to when that call is going to be announced. So for example, you might have seen like in certain budget announcements, okay, we're going to do this grant, for in my world, for women entrepreneurs or for Black owned businesses. And occasionally I know from talking to folks in government that they'll like quickly get emails from those businesses saying, great, how do I apply for this? And actually, like there's some work that department will need to do. So just understanding what those timelines are as well. The announcement of the funding opportunity will come. So it's just about being patient and being prepared. And you can start that preparation by looking at what's in the budget or what was in that initial announcement. And then in terms of what you want to put into a pre-budget submission, that's a really good question, because those are really the opportunities to kind of create your own wins outside of a public competition, which both are certainly difficult to do. But in terms of what you want in that pre-budget submission, first and foremost, I wouldn't submit it cold. So I would do my best to try to, talk to the relevant stakeholders. So ministers, their staff, parliamentary secretaries, the folks who are going to actually be putting things forward to the Department of Finance on your behalf. Like, make sure that they are in your corner, that they're your champions, and that they have that submission, they have that budget proposal even before you send it into finance, and that'll give you a bit of a softer landing. Again, you do typically need to convince that line ministry, so that finance department ministry, that this is something that they want to do, and then also go to finance and help them understand why it's such an important priority. So for the pre-budget submission, like, short and sweet is certainly better, but making sure that you have in there sort of who you are, what you do, why is it so impactful. I think the impact is such an important aspect to get across, and qualitative is great if you have one or two great stories of success, but really it's about the data that they're going to look at, because they are looking at this very much on a cost-benefit basis, and again, that ROI. So what's the impact that you have now, and how might that impact change or grow with this investment? Another thing that they often want to see is sort of, who else is investing in this program, and is it all going to be on the federal government? Do you have corporate partners or provincial partners or in-kind partners that are contributing as well? That will show some of the sort of stability, long-term sustainability of the program or the project that you're proposing. And then also, what are some other stakeholders that might have the ear of government that you can get to either write you a letter of support that you either include in that package or separately, that might have the ear of government? And again, Jesse, as you pointed out, that might be a partner that you're working with on this proposal. It could be your board chair, if they're a high profile individual that might have the ear of government. Or they might, it could even be someone from a community that you're working with that is going to really speak to why this is important.
That's great. Thank you, Micah. I'm getting concerned because we're almost out of time, and we could probably have a part two of even this conversation. So I do want to, I think, probably start wrapping up, just because we will have another LinkedIn Live again in a couple of weeks, and just watch onto my socials, my LinkedIn and Twitter page, and the company's LinkedIn page as well, for information about that. And Rachel Faith can share links as well, what she's been doing. I think the only thing I would add also to your excellent points around the budget submission would just be to say, also it's good to look for good company and look for other organizations that are interested in similar issues. And the more that you can align some of your messaging together with them, and as well as being very much in line with what you've talked to the government about, that's the ideal. If you can get kind of a number of organizations that have all spoken to government working together and pointing in the same direction, your voice will be that much more powerful. There was one last question that I saw, which I think was a great question as well, which is, do governments offer startup funding for nonprofits? And I mean, I don't want to say, kind of categorically no. I would say that it's harder in terms of, again, for all the reasons we were talking about around risk. I think that they're often more reluctant to, maybe invest heavily in new organizations. But you know what, that being said, like, I think these days, I think there's, thankfully, and at long last, more of a concerted effort to reach out to diverse constituencies and to new organizations and different kinds of organizations. So I think the door is more open now, maybe, than it's been in the past. And then I think the other thing I would say is that, I think that there are some unique funds that are out there that are kind of small, one-off kinds of funds that you can look for that could help you get started. The challenge there is that they're often going to be project-based, as Micah said. So they're not necessarily going to help you keep the lights on or help you, with all the other information, all the other money that you need to run your organization. But it's a place to start. Before we wrap up, Micah, thank you so much. I'm incredibly grateful. This has been a great conversation. Thanks for coming and sharing all of your own insights and experiences. And I'll just give you a minute or two for your last word, and then we'll wrap it up.
No, for sure. I really appreciate the opportunity, Jesse, and this is a great session. I hope folks took a lot away from it. I always love having these conversations about government and nonprofit work. As you know, I think we like had so many like coffees and lunches while we were Right to Play, just kind of like talking about this and talking about issues facing the sector as a whole. And so it feels like a very natural continuation of that, and would be happy to chat again. But I will put it out there to anyone on the call if you're ever interested in learning more about the work that I do or my career path or anything like that, do feel free to reach out. I think, collaboration and connection is so important in our sector. And, Jesse hinted at it several times with, on the partnership side, and collaboration is also very important to government. They don't want to see, duplicative efforts. They really want folks to work together and efficiently. And, one takeaway for everyone, and I think Jesse mentioned it before, is like, all of these people are just people, and at the end of the day, they're doing this work for very similar reasons that you are, and it's really just about sort of aligning the work that you're doing with the priorities that they might have specifically. And different political stripes might have different approaches to solving the problems that are facing Canada and facing the world, but they are all in this work to solve those problems. And so, putting it in that language that is appropriate to them, or the approach that is appropriate to them, you will get those meetings, and you will be able to sort of drive your policy area forward.
Wonderful. We'll end on that great note. Thank you so much, Micah, and thanks everyone for joining us, and stay tuned for our upcoming session. Thanks again.